The most unsettling form of control is the one that never announces itself. There are no commands, no confrontations, no visible struggle for dominance. Yet behavior shifts, decisions slow, and reactions soften without explanation. When that happens repeatedly, people begin to notice that silence itself is doing the work. For Jamie Dornan, control has always looked like self-discipline. He is known for regulating his public image carefully, choosing words with intention and maintaining emotional balance under scrutiny. That consistency is precisely why the changes stand out when they occur. When discipline slips only in one specific context, it raises questions. Those questions almost always lead back to the same presence. Dakota Johnson does not issue demands or seek attention in these moments. She doesn't interrupt, correct, or steer conversations overtly. Instead, she remains still, observant, and unreactive, which paradoxically amplifies her influence. Psychologists describe this phenomenon as unconscious regulation. One person becomes an emotional reference point for another, causing automatic adjustments without conscious intent. This isn't manipulation in the traditional sense, because no action is taken. The control emerges from association rather than instruction. What makes this dynamic compelling is how consistently Jamie appears to recalibrate when Dakota is present. His posture shifts slightly, his voice lowers, and his pacing changes. These are not dramatic gestures, but subtle recalibrations that suggest internal monitoring. He appears to be responding to something he feels rather than something she does. Crucially, this pattern does not repeat itself with others. Jamie interacts comfortably with colleagues, fans, and interviewers without visible disruption. The contrast is what sharpens attention. Influence becomes visible only when it is selective. Dakota's role in this is passive, but not neutral. Passivity does not mean absence of effect. In many interpersonal dynamics, the person who speaks less sets the tone simply by holding space. Silence, when paired with familiarity, can exert more pressure than words. Observers often misinterpret this as intentional control, but the evidence suggests something more organic. Dakota does not appear to seek dominance or leverage. Instead, Jamie seems to adjust himself around her, as if responding to an internal signal activated by proximity. The control, if it exists, originates within him. This kind of influence is powerful because it cannot be confronted directly. There is no behavior to challenge, no statement to deny. If asked, Dakota could truthfully say she has done nothing. And she would be right. The effect exists without action. From a behavioral standpoint, this is what makes the situation unsettling. Control without intent feels more dangerous because it bypasses consent and awareness. Jamie is not choosing to be influenced, he is reacting before choice occurs. That reaction is what audiences pick up on instinctively. Over time, these moments accumulate. A single instance could be dismissed as coincidence or fatigue, but repetition across years and settings creates a pattern too stable to ignore. Patterns suggest structure, and structure suggests something deeper than chance. The most telling detail is how quickly Jamie corrects himself after these moments. Control returns almost immediately, as if he recognizes the shift and compensates. That rapid correction implies awareness of vulnerability. You don't correct what you don't notice. This dynamic reframes the idea of control entirely. It isn't Dakota exerting power outward, but Jamie conceding power inward. He adapts because something in him responds automatically to her presence. The influence is real, even if unspoken. By the end of this first layer, the story is no longer about manipulation or intent. It becomes about emotional gravity and how it shapes behavior without permission. Dakota does not need to say a word because nothing is being asked. The control exists in the response, not the request. What unsettles people is not the idea of influence, but how quietly it operates. In a world where power is usually loud and visible, silent influence feels unnatural. Yet it may be the most authentic form there is. And once it's noticed, it becomes impossible to ignore. Once this pattern of silent influence became visible, it reshaped how every interaction was interpreted. What once looked like coincidence began to feel intentional, even if no intent could be proven. The absence of words made the influence harder to challenge, because nothing concrete was being said or done. Control without language leaves no evidence trail, only effect. For Jamie Dornan, this created an internal contradiction that was difficult to resolve. He appeared neither trapped nor entirely free, operating in a space where autonomy and response blurred together. Adjusting behavior became second nature, almost reflexive, as if emotional calibration happened before conscious thought. That kind of self-regulation is exhausting precisely because it never feels chosen. The public struggled to categorize what they were seeing. This wasn't dominance in the traditional sense, nor was it submission. It looked more like alignment, an unconscious syncing that altered tempo and tone. When someone changes simply because another person is present, observers interpret power even if none is exercised. This is why silent influence is so difficult to dismantle. There is no argument to win, no boundary to redraw, and no accusation to refute. The dynamic survives because it exists below language, operating through familiarity and emotional memory. As long as those remain unresolved, the influence persists. Dakota Johnson occupies a unique position within this dynamic. She does not appear to seek leverage, attention, or reaction. Her consistency, rather than any overt behavior, becomes the stabilizing force that others orient around. In that sense, her power is not active but gravitational. What complicates matters further is how this dynamic plays in public space. Cameras amplify moments that would otherwise pass unnoticed. A pause, a glance, or a shift in tone becomes symbolic when repeated enough times. Audiences begin to read these signals as communication, even when none is intended. Attempts to neutralize the narrative through distance often backfire. Reduced interaction increases anticipation, and anticipation heightens scrutiny. When the moment finally arrives, it carries disproportionate weight. Silence, rather than diffusing attention, concentrates it. Psychologically, this creates a loop that is difficult to exit. Awareness leads to control, control leads to tension, and tension makes influence more visible. The more someone tries to appear unaffected, the more any deviation stands out. Effort becomes evidence. From the outside, this can look like power imbalance, even if both individuals are acting within their own boundaries. Influence does not require agreement or consent to function. It only requires emotional relevance. When relevance is strong, behavior adapts automatically. The cost of this adaptation is subtle but cumulative. Over time, self-monitoring replaces spontaneity, and neutrality replaces ease. Decisions are filtered not through desire, but through avoidance of reaction. That shift reshapes how someone moves through both personal and professional spaces. Observers often mistake this for weakness, but it's closer to vulnerability. Being influenced silently means being exposed without knowing how to protect oneself. There is no clear action to stop, because nothing explicit is happening. The influence exists precisely because it is unspoken. This is why public fascination persists. The story doesn't resolve because there is nothing to resolve outwardly. No confession would end it, and no denial would erase it. The dynamic lives in behavior, not statements. As time passes, the narrative becomes less about control and more about inevitability. People begin to accept the influence as part of the landscape rather than an anomaly. It becomes something expected, even anticipated. In that acceptance, the power of silence deepens. The most uncomfortable realization is that silent influence often says more about the one responding than the one present. Control without words only works when something inside is already listening. That internal readiness is what gives the influence shape. In the end, the story isn't about domination or intent. It's about how unresolved connection can guide behavior without ever announcing itself. Dakota doesn't need to speak, because nothing is being asked. Jamie adjusts because something in him responds. That is what makes this form of control so compelling and so unsettling. It cannot be confronted, denied, or proven away. It simply exists in the space between presence and reaction. And once people see it, they begin to understand that the quietest influences are often the most enduring.